Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. The good news is the American economy is changing and corporations are getting lean and mean. Unemployment is low, inflation is down, and the stock market is up. The bad news is the American economy is changing and corporations are getting lean and mean. Millions of Americans have received the proverbial pink slip, many more fear for their jobs. What does corporate downsizing mean for America, for the economy, and for you? Joining us to sort through the conflict and the consensus are Robert Samuelson, author of The Good Life and Its Discontents, The American Dream in the Age of Entitlement, 1945 to 1995. Isabel Sawhill, R.J. Miller Chair in Public Policy at the Urban Institute. Irwin Stelzer, Director of Regulatory Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And Lester Thurow, author of the recently published The Future of Capitalism, How Today's Economic Forces Shape Tomorrow's World. The question before this House, is there an upside to downsizing? This week on Think Tank. What we call downsizing today is nothing new. A changing economy is as American as pizza. The end of the 19th century witnessed a revolution in agriculture and manufacturing. New technologies created new industries and destroyed old ones. Thanks to the invention of the automobile, the rubber and petroleum industries came into being. But blacksmiths and wagon companies were downsized and destroyed. Job losses and suffering seem to be inevitable byproducts of economic and technological change. Today, American society is riding the crest of another revolution, the so-called third wave economy, led by the information and service sectors. Fiber optics and computer software are booming, and so are service industries like express mail delivery and restaurant chains. But many workers feel that this third wave economy has an undertow, and they're being dragged down. In the last 7 years, almost 3 million workers have been laid off. This time, restructuring, downsizing, and layoffs have reached beyond blue-collar workers and hit managers and professionals. And there is an argument about whether downsizing is an unavoidable result of economic changes or caused this time by big business firing people in order to reap short-term profits. Politicians have seized on downsizing as a major issue in the 1996 election. But what is downsizing really doing to the economy? There's another side to the picture. The unemployment rate is only 5.6% lower today than it's been in many years. And the average worker between ages 45 and 54 holds a job for nearly 10 years, longer now than 20 years ago. The stock market is hitting all-time highs. That's good news for investors and the tens of millions of Americans with pension plans, but critics say today's market rises at the expense of long-term corporate health. Let's start out just going around the room once quickly and get some definitions out there and some ideas. Bob Samuelson, what is corporate downsizing? What do you think its effects are?
Well, I think downsizing is just a new label for an old phenomenon, and that is that companies change. Some of them go out of business, some of them split up, some of them lay off workers, some of them drop divisions. And in management, people like fads and they like new labels, and so we have downsizing. But I think really what is going on is just a new variant of what's always going on.
Okay, Irwin Stelzer, is it a fad?
It's certainly, the name is a fad. I mean, what is going on is what Bob described. Plus one other thing, I think the dominant large American corporation is being replaced by lots of smaller ones. AT&T is going away somewhat. We have Sprint and MCI. So a lot of the downsizing you see is simply a loss of market share by once dominant monopolies, and a very healthy result.
Sawhill.
I think that there's something going on here that's related to the extra competition that American businesses now face in a world economy that's putting terrific pressure on them to be more productive, more competitive than they were in the past, and is creating some problems for some group of workers.
Lester Thurow, is
I think the thing that's different is companies have always gone into business and laid people off, but what frightens people is now profitable companies that are laying people off, as opposed to companies like your buggy whip maker that were basically going out of business. And the other thing, of course, is if you look at people who are downsized, they take a big cut in wages. And if you're over age 55, this is really devastating because you're not likely to get reemployed.
The argument was made, and I think you talked about it, Les, that AT&T has cut these 40,000 jobs, and that's become sort of a symbol. But haven't other telecommunications companies, I mean MCI, Sprint, the cellular companies, the internet companies, this is a booming industry. Haven't they picked up jobs?
It's like your introduction. It's simultaneously optimism and pessimism. The pessimism, of course, is if you look at AT&T, here used to be the prime American corporation that gave you a good job with high real wages and rising wages. They're laying, this is not the first layoffs at AT&T, this is the third or fourth round of layoffs. On the other hand, the optimistic side is you got all kinds of opportunities for new companies to do new things. And if you look at total employment in the telecommunication industry, it's about the same as it was 5 or 6 years ago. And so it's optimism.
The consumer has many more options than in
consumer does, but if you were that worker for AT&T, it's pessimism.
Well, I think we have to keep in mind what you've hinted at, which is what the consumer is getting. I mean, the price of telecommunication services is just coming down enormously. And that's partly the result of increased competition, which is reflected in this so-called AT&T downsizing. Remember, AT&T was a huge, cozy monopoly that didn't have to respond to market forces.
But see, most of that's technology, because if you look at the rate of decline of prices in telecommunication, it didn't speed up after deregulation. It's been going down at about the same pace over the last 20 years. And the big thing is technology. Now, I think we did some very positive things as the result of the split up of AT&T, but let's not give the split up all the credit for the decrease in the price of phone calls. Most of that's technology.
Well, and also deregulation, which has increased the range of consumer options. I mean, I did a lot of work with AT&T, and the markets were orderly. The rate of introduction of new service was orderly. It's not anymore, which is a wonderful thing for consumers.
Being disorderly is a hallmark of capitalism and a good thing, you say?
I think disorder is a great thing in markets.
No, but you do have this group of older executives, the guy who's given 25 years of his life to AT&T or whomever. That person didn't used to get laid off, before they retired.
Weren't so many of these people downsized out? I remember just before the 1992 election, GM announced a big downsizing, 78,000 people's in the front page.
They were losing money.
Well, but wait a minute. Down at the bottom of the story, it said that they were all either early retirements, early outs, buyouts. There was going to be over a 5-year period. There really was not much there. Why are the corporations, behaving, it seems to me, idiotically and sort of flexing their muscles, saying, look how many people we downsized, when in point of fact, they could almost be saying it's organic and, it's...
Well, but there is something that's changed here, and it's true that some of the people who lose their jobs are being eliminated either through attrition or buyouts or early retirement, but some people are just being outright fired. And a lot of the people who are losing their jobs through buyouts don't really want to leave. They're taking that because it's the best option, and they may find another job, and the buyout may be reasonably generous. But I think corporate behavior has changed in the last 10 or 15 years, and I don't think it's in the last 18 months. But in the 70s and even through parts of the early 80s, corporate managers who considered themselves responsible tried to avoid layoffs among their career workers, among precisely the people you are talking about. Now they are not. But I think what we need to recognize is, in some ways, not for the individual worker who gets laid off now and might not have been laid off in comparable circumstances 20 years ago, but in some ways for society, this may be a beneficial development.
Belle, what do you think about that? You buy that?
Well, I do think something has changed from the 60s or the 70s, but I think that there's so much focus on a few companies, the AT&T story or the IBM story or the GM story, and when we look at the actual numbers of people who are involved, although one would never want to minimize the impact on individual communities or families, nevertheless, overall, these are not large numbers of people. The unemployment rate right now is as low as it has been with the exception of about 3 or 4 other times in the last 25 years. So we must be creating jobs at the same time that we're destroying them. Otherwise, the unemployment rate wouldn't be so low.
But that's a little bit like saying the rape rate is low and therefore women shouldn't worry about rape, because objectively your probability of being raped is not very high. That's all true, but the real issue, I think there's something you mentioned in the beginning is key. As late as the 80-81 recession, most of the people who were laid off were blue-collar workers. And they were used to being laid off. They were laid off, they were hired back. This was kind of a normal thing. But very few people in the recessions up till 90-91 were white-collar workers and managers. And what has changed is who gets laid off.
To some extent, we've democratized this.
Oh, I didn't say it was terrible.
Yeah, it's to some extent. So it gets more visibility because the people who run programs like this, who write for the New York Times, can more easily identify with the people who are being laid off. But in terms of the social harm that's being caused, it's a bit more traumatic for those people, because it's true that a lot of those people never expected to be laid off and never thought they would have to worry about it. So there is a little bit more anxiety perhaps among that subset of people. But as Bell points out, jobs are being created very rapidly. The anxiety, to some extent, I think, is causing moderation in wage behavior, which has sustained the economic expansion. And I would say, in their totality, our labor markets are probably working better today than they were working 20 years ago.
Isn't that nice, clean expression, moderation in wage expansion? Yeah. Isn't that somebody not getting more money? It sounds nice.
But you see, it's just the old kind of dilemma of economics. It's sort of things that look bad for an individual may be good for the entire system, and then, therefore, in some ways, good for everybody. But see, that when you look at, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay. Well, first of all, let's clear up the downsizing question. There's a resizing going on. The fact is, when AT&T lays off a whole bunch of workers, very often what's replacing those jobs are lots of small companies. Most of the jobs that have been added in the economy in the past 10 or 15 years are small companies. Well, it's a big headline when you lay off 10,000 workers. It isn't a big headline when you hire 10. So I think you have a disjunction in that you have a transfer of employment from very big companies to much smaller companies.
Second, I think you are sort of surrounded by optimoids. Well, here. I think of a pessimoid.
I think there's a problem coming down the pike for corporate America out of all of this. And you see it very clearly if you, like myself, where you work in a business school. You used to be a dean of a business school.
At MIT.
At MIT, because what's happening if you look at people who are getting MBAs, they are currently cynical beyond belief and don't believe in corporate loyalty whatsoever. And so what you've got in corporate America more is kind of schizophrenia. Because the other thing the big corporations are saying, in addition to the fact that we've got to downsize, right size, or whatever the word is, teamwork. And how do you preach teamwork at the same time you're downsizing?
And this is why you have a very nervous view of the future of capitalism.
I think this is one of the things that's going to create tremendous problems going out into the future, because if you look at the attitude of those people who are going into the management cadres, it is a very different attitude than the people who went into the management cadres 20 years ago.
But what I think you've just said the opposite side of what Bob said. The labor market is working better. You don't have people salted away in big corporations with low productivity. You have them moving where they can get paid more, where their marginal revenue product is higher. You have more fluid labor markets. You have great loyalty in Germany to corporations, and you have an 11% unemployment rate. You have great immobility in France. You have a 12.5% unemployment rate. A fluid labor market may be more nervous-making.
As Les says, isn't corporate loyalty a good competitive tool for a corporation to have? Aren't we eroding that? Don't you want to have loyal, trustworthy, honest, etc.?
I'm for trustworthy and honest. I don't know what loyal means. In other words, if you want to have employees who are cosseted, who are kept on, like as the steel industry used to do, and then suddenly gotten rid of, or kept on forever.
And like the big networks, by the way.
Look, the only way living standards can go up is if productivity goes up.
What do you say when people say, Irwin Stelzer, you are not compassionate?
I say it's the compassion of people like whoever said that to me that has brought us to the state we're in with the welfare system and other things that are.
No, but let me say where teamwork.
Could I say what I think the bigger problem is here? I think, as someone said a little while ago, the big problem is wages. Real earnings have really not been going up, particularly for the less educated males. And that's because productivity has been growing very, very slowly. So if we're concerned about what's happening to incomes, we have to be concerned about productivity. And if we're concerned about productivity, then it seems to me that all firms have to be worried about whether they're going to be, using people as efficiently as possible, and that's going to lead to some downsizing. And that's the fallout from trying to become competitive and having productivity growth and higher standards of living. I don't think that there aren't some social problems associated with this. I think there are. But that's the fundamental economic problem.
Yeah, I want to talk about where loyalty and teamwork are important. Suppose you're Intel and designing a new chip where you got a team of 3 or 4 engineers doing it. You can't afford a lot of turnover in that team. And what you're telling a generation of Americans is, no matter what you're doing and how important it is to the company's future, if somebody else offers you $1 more, get out the door.
Well, why can't you sign an employment contract for the length of the
why can't
development of
Intel
that
pay them
chip,
more?
for example? I mean, I assume that's
Intel
what they
can pay them
do.
more.
Because the answer is, I take the knowledge about that chip to Intel's competitors, and Intel already knows what it's doing, so that I'm more valuable to the competitor. And you've had semiconductor firms in Silicon Valley that have gotten into all kinds of trouble because of turnover in their engineering ranks. And the idea that you can run corporations with people coming and going crazy, it just doesn't work.
But that is true up to a point, and that is the dynamic that most large corporations face. They have to keep their costs down. So if they've got too many workers, they've got to reduce their workforces. A lot of companies, by the way, don't have too many workers. Not everybody is downsizing. Not everybody is throwing people out the door. But on the other hand, most large corporations do have to maintain some sort of continuity, and they need to maintain good relationships. And that's why, in fact, most middle-aged workers, especially middle-aged workers reasonably skilled, have stable jobs. It's because companies recognize that in their own economic self-interest, they must maintain stable relationships. Now, you talk about the semiconductor industry. This has always been a problem in the semiconductor industry, going back to the 60s. Intel itself was a spin-off of an earlier semiconductor company, and it's been a problem because what you have in these new industries particularly is you have a lot of very ambitious, high-energy people, often want to make a lot of money, often simply want to run their own show, and they're not willing to play third or fourth fiddle to other people.
What about the politics of this thing? Forgetting whether or not you think it's bad or good, hasn't it become a corrosive political issue? I mean, you had Pat Buchanan raising it, the labor unions are raising it, saying it's a terrible thing. President Clinton is on board. You now have the situation because Clinton has been in office for 3 years. Even the Republicans are saying, oh my God, these corporate nasty brutes are laying off people. Isn't this in itself a corrosive situation?
Well, I don't know how this is going to play out politically, and I'm not sure it's easy for either party to exploit it. Clinton is he has always played on people's insecurities and anxieties. On the other hand, he is the incumbent now. And if he says people are more insecure now than they were 3 or 4 years ago, it seems to me it's going to ricochet on him. I think that these are basically issues that are disconnected from political personalities. They may try to be exploited by politicians, but these are economic trends, and we ought to get away from the notion that politicians cause, either for good or for ill, anything good or bad that happens in the economy. They are not omnipotent, and I think it's going to be very difficult to play this issue in the economy.
I would like to say amen to that. I happen to agree with that politicians are making this case that they sit down in the basement of the White House with a little machine and they do something called create jobs, and Democrats believe it, Republicans lie about it, but because they don't even believe it, and it's just not so. Would you like to rebut that, Bell Sawhill?
No, I actually have quite a lot of sympathy with that argument, particularly on this whole downsizing question. I think it would be counterproductive to try to do the kinds of things the Europeans do, go in and tell employers that they have to keep their workers, they have to provide certain benefits, and you get so many safety nets that the labor market stops working and you have double-digit unemployment. And so for all of our so-called insecurity, we at least have low unemployment, we have more growth, and so I think government could make matters worse. Now, that doesn't mean that outside of corporate America, we shouldn't strengthen some safety nets for those who are earning low wages.
Les Thurow, you have described yourself, I think, as the last Euro optimist.
Right.
Bell has just said that it isn't working in
Oh,
Europe.
I wouldn't put all the restrictions on labor that the Europeans did. I'm a European optimist for other reasons.
You wrote that Europeans aren't creating jobs, but that their wages are going up.
They protected the wages of the existing employees at the cost of not creating jobs. I don't think that's right.
And unemployment has gone way up.
Unemployment's gone way up. Now, we have a lot of hidden unemployment, too. You know, if you look at this new unemployment index that was just put out, where you add in the part-timers who want full-time work, and you add in the people who don't meet one of these technical tests for being unemployed, but they still say they're looking for work. And if you look at you got 8 million Americans who work in temporary jobs, and you got 8 million people who are now called self-employed contractors. A lot of them are professionals who are too proud to call themselves unemployed. I think we have more unemployment than 5.6.
You have to subtract the first 4 or 5% because it's frictional unemployment of people who have left their jobs voluntarily. I mean, just that goes up and down.
Your original question was, forget whether it's true or false, what's the politics of it? It seems to me the politics of it is if Mr. Buchanan had been running in the Democratic primaries, he would have gotten more than 25 or 30% of the vote. Because if you think of it, he was sounding like Roosevelt, malefactors of great wealth, all of these kind of phrases. And I think there is a floating hostile group out there that are a little bit like that movie Network. Remember where he said, throw open the window, throw your head out and scream, I'm mad as hell. I think
I'm not going to take it anymore.
I'm not going to take it anymore. And I think there are a lot of Americans that put the head out the window and said, I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore. And then the question is, does the political process respond in an intelligent way with some things that make sense, or does the political process respond in a non-intelligent way? But respond it will.
Today is 1996. Transport yourself 20 years into the future. It's now 2016. What's it going to look like?
I have no idea.
You write for a newspaper and you have no idea?
No idea.
Oh, wow.
What can I say?
Well, you can say capitalism is going to solve its problems.
I will tell you this. In the early 60s, if you would have brought 100 economists into a room and said, will the United States ever have double-digit inflation outside post-war time, I doubt you would have gotten one to say yes. And yet, within a dozen years, we had double-digit inflation. You can look at almost every major crisis we have had, and most of them were unpredicted. So the answer is, I don't know. If you're asking, do I think capitalism is going to survive? Yeah, I think it's going to survive in some form, not all that different in a social sense from what we have today, because it survived for 200 years, and it's part of the political culture of the United States. It is not simply an economic system which we have and can discard for something else. It is a part of our political and popular culture. So, yes, I think capitalism is going to survive.
All right. Irwin Stelzer.
Since I won't be around in 20 years, I'm much older than you, I can be braver. The notion that there's a middle class out there waiting to explode seems to me a bit far-fetched. The middle class out there is buying houses in record numbers, buying cars in record numbers, borrowing money, doing all the things of people who expect to have a future to look forward to. So I don't see any incipient revolution. I see people becoming acquainted with what used to afflict only insecurity that used to afflict only blue-collar people who didn't write letters to the Washington Post and the New York Times. I see the decline of the, quote, good corporation, the paternalistic corporation, deciding how to deploy its monopoly profits as a good thing, and so therefore I'm relatively optimistic about the future.
Del Sawhill.
There is something new here, which is that American workers are having to compete with workers all around the world, many of whom are coming up educationally and yet earn much lower wages. So there's going to be this continuing pressure, it seems to me, downward pressure on wages in this country from this global competition. And somehow or other, we're going to have to make some adjustments that don't interfere with the efficiency and competitiveness of our economy, but deal with some of the social fallout from this.
Will we be successful at that?
Who knows?
I think we're going to get a very unhappy middle class, because whatever you believe about absolute wages, the distribution is spreading out, and you get this very widespread sentiment at the moment among the middle class that my children are not going to have the standard of living that I had. They're going to have a lower standard of living. And I think in a country like the United States, that is politically explosive. Now, I think we're going to have capitalism 20 years from now because there is no other system that exists. Socialism, communism, all these other, Nazism, all these other things have gone away. But I think if you think you don't have an unhappy middle class, then you're not living in the real America.
Okay, thank you, Lester Thurow, Robert Samuelson, Isabel Sawhill and Irwin Stelzer, and thank you. Please send your comments and questions to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036, or we can be reached by email at thinktv@aol.com or on the World Wide Web at www.thinktank.com. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.